Olá, boa noite. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao Roda Viva. Estamos no ar para todo o Brasil, pela TV Cultura e emissoras afiliadas, e conectados ao mundo pelo UOL, YouTube, Twitter e Facebook. O capitalismo venceu. Depois de séculos de disputas entre diferentes meios de organizar a produção econômica, hoje o sistema capitalista reina absoluto com diferentes configurações em todo o mundo. O triunfo do capitalismo e suas consequências políticas e sociais é o foco do novo livro do nosso entrevistado desta noite, um dos maiores especialistas hoje no tema da desigualdade econômica. Para discutir como este capitalismo dominante vai responder à maior crise econômica e social em mais de um século, provocada pelo novo coronavírus, e se o pós-pandemia tende a agravar a desigualdade social nos países e no mundo, está no centro do Roda Viva hoje, diretamente dos Estados Unidos, o economista Branko Milanovic.
Formado em economia com PhD pela Universidade de Belgrado, na Sérvia, ele foi economista-chefe do Departamento de Pesquisa do Banco Mundial. Lecionou, entre outras instituições, na Universidade de Maryland, na Johns Hopkins University, na London School of Economics e atualmente é professor da Universidade da Cidade de Nova York. Um dos mais respeitados estudiosos da desigualdade social, ele acredita que, diante de tantas diferenças sociais expostas pela crise do coronavírus, os governos têm espaço para a adoção de políticas voltadas para a diminuição do abismo existente entre ricos e pobres. Isso inclui, além de programas de renda mínima, uma profunda reforma no setor educacional, visando a melhoria das escolas públicas, o que abriria novas oportunidades para os jovens vindos de famílias de baixa renda. Entre suas propostas, também se inclui uma reforma tributária com taxação sobre heranças.
Para entrevistar Branko Milanovic, nós convidamos Alexandre Borges, analista político e colunista da Gazeta do Povo; Denise Godoy, editora-chefe de Negócios e Finanças da revista Exame; Lígia Guimarães, editora da BBC News Brasil; Marta Arretti, cientista política, professora da USP e colunista do Nexo Jornal; e Martim Vasques da Cunha, escritor e jornalista. Boa noite, Branko. Muito obrigada por ter aceitado o nosso convite para estar aqui nesta noite.
Well, thank you very much. It's actually a pleasure to be there. I wish it were like more direct and not remote, but this is the best that we can do under the current conditions.
É verdade, todos nós estamos enfrentando essas restrições. Branko, no seu livro você fala muito da vitória do capitalismo, mas ele foi publicado um pouco antes da pandemia do novo coronavírus virar o mundo de cabeça para baixo. Eu sei que você está escrevendo um capítulo adicional para a próxima edição do livro, que vai tratar das consequências dessa pandemia. Queria saber, você já consegue adiantar para a gente algumas das linhas desse capítulo que você está escrevendo? O que você acha que a pandemia da Covid-19 muda nessa dominância do capitalismo no mundo?
Well, once again, thank you very much for having me. Let me try to explain a little bit the background that you already mentioned, but I would like to expand it a little bit. I'm, of course, somebody who has been working for many years, as you said, in inequality, individual countries' inequalities, and global inequality. Now, the book is also structured around inequality because it looks, in the case of the United States, which I call the meritocratic or liberal capitalism, and the case of China, or political capitalism, how the elites are being created and how income inequality is being transmitted across generations. So that was the structure of the book. Now, the second sort of a framework of the book is something which is rather obvious. You mentioned it also, is the triumph of capitalism. When I said it's obvious, it is obvious for those who sort of care to think about how China has been organized and the fact that the private sector is the dominant sector in China. So in that sense, of course, I think that it is clear that capitalism has now become an entirely global system. Now, to go back to the question that you asked me, yes, I do plan to write a subscript. You know, it may not be the full chapter, looking at how coronavirus, what we now think, might affect the future. You know, I have to say that this is what we think now, because the virus is not at its end. We really don't know how long this will continue, and obviously then what changes it will make. Now, the longer it continues, the greater will be the changes. Just to sort of end my answer, I would say that certainly what we know now, I believe, is that there will be a more important role of the state within individual countries. And I also believe this would be a setback for globalization, the way that we have actually known it in the last 30 years.
Muito obrigada. Pergunta agora da Lígia.
Professor Branco, um prazer falar com o senhor. Queria aproveitar esse gancho do que vai mudar, o que já mudou, né, na globalização com a pandemia. O senhor cita um pouco os efeitos da pandemia sobre as cadeias produtivas globais de valor, que são importantes para o Brasil, né, que é aquela indústria que divide a produção em vários países. O que pode acontecer com a pandemia, com essas cadeias, e como que isso pode afetar países que precisam dela, como o Brasil?
You know, what I think is actually will happen, but I have to say that all we are now speculating because, again, we don't know really how long the crisis will continue. But what I think is seems clear so far is that the global value chains that play a role in my book as well, because they have been really a means whereby capitalist relations of production from the developed countries have really spread all over the world. So they really played a very important role. They have also enabled many countries to access technology that in the past they could not. Just to say on that, actually, many people who work on development in the past used always to complain that actually poorer countries or emerging countries did not have access to technologies from the rich countries. And that was a topic that was done very often by the World Bank or the IMF or the others. Well, with the global value chains, that problem disappeared because the global value chains and those who organize them have an incentive to actually use the best technology in the countries where they organize global value chains. Now, how they would be affected, I think that what is actually clear so far is that they have been constructed under the assumption that everything happens as it was sort of originally envisaged. That means that they have been constructed in a very efficient way, provided there are no big shocks. What the pandemic has done, it has introduced a very big shock. When you have a big shock and you have a system that is designed without regard to that shock, then you have really a problem. And this is actually what we have seen now. The different parts of the global value chains are not able to deliver, and that it has actually an outsized effect on the rest of the global value chain. You know, it is like when you have something which is where an input sort of feeds into next output, and it's a whole chain, and there is one small part of the chain that is missing, then the entire chain collapses. And this is actually, I think, what we are now seeing in parts, and what would actually then mean in the future is that the people would be much more careful how they design the global value chains, and they might also prefer to keep them closer to home than currently.
Muito obrigada. Alexandre, por favor.
Professor Branco, obrigado pela entrevista. Em relação à parte conceitual do seu livro, o senhor evidentemente está preocupado com o que é capitalismo, quais são os diferentes tipos, ou socialismo, social-democracia, comunismo. Algumas premissas que são usadas, conceituais, no livro, elas têm bases muito claras e são citadas em autores de esquerda. O Marx, por exemplo, me parece que a maior presença em termos de citação, tanto Marx como marxismo, aparecem 120 vezes, pelo que eu pude contar no livro. O segundo que aparece tanto seria o Thomas Piketty, com 26, muito menos, enfim. O senhor acha que a sua obra é uma obra de esquerda ou basicamente indicada para leitores de esquerda, ou ela é para um público mais geral? E como tem sido a recepção da sua obra em todos os campos ideológicos desde que foi lançado?
Well, thank you first for counting the number of references. I didn't count them. I'm going to do that now because obviously I have the PDF version, but it's very, interesting that, Marx has 120 references. The way that I actually see it, as you said, methodologically, I think there is a very strong Marxist background methodologically, because the definition of capitalism is entirely Marxist definition. I also emphasize the role of classes in the discussion of the liberal or meritocratic capitalism. That role is really very important, because I think that there is a significant importance or the difference in the way that you acquire your income, whether you do it through labor or capital. And it has actually lots of implications, not the least that in one case you have to work and to show up at work, as we know nowadays, for example, with essential workers. In the other case, you can just sit at home and income will come. So that class difference is very important. And it has actually changed over the time. And this is, of course, part of my discussion, talking about the fact that we now have more and more situation where you have very rich people who have both capital and labor income. So methodologically, as you said, I think it's very, very Marxist in its orientation. Now, it is also Marxist, although in a little bit maybe perverse way, by arguing that actually it was the communist revolutions in countries like China and Vietnam that set the base for the development of autochthonous or domestic capitalism. I don't want to go into that a lot, but I think it's an important part of the book that actually discusses how capitalism in China developed differently from the capitalism in dominant Western countries. So I would see the book very much a book of the left, and even the fact that actually I talk a lot about reproduction of the elites is very much something that people on the left do. What is a little bit confusing to people is that I argue that actually capitalism is now the only mode of production, and I don't see a blueprint for a socialist mode of production which would exclude private ownership of the means of production or exclude hired labor. Although I have to say at the very end, I do mention a possibility, and maybe we'll talk about that later, a possibility that hired labor might actually cease to play the role that it does now, in which case one of the key components of how we define capitalism might change. So in that sense, there is a possibility that actually in the future we might see something different than capitalism.
Obrigada, Marta, por favor.
Professor Branco, muito prazer. No seu livro, o senhor argumenta que seria possível entender as tendências os conflitos das sociedades contemporâneas com base em duas categorias: o capitalismo meritocrático liberal, do qual os Estados Unidos seria um prototipo, e o capitalismo político, da qual a China seria um caso típico, né? Eu suponho que muitos analistas europeus tenderiam a aceitar, a resistir à ideia de que os Estados Unidos possam ser considerado representativo das democracias liberais contemporâneas, né? Porque os países europeus teriam políticas de tributação, políticas de combate à desigualdade, a social-democracia teria avançado muito mais no século XX na Europa do que nos Estados Unidos, né? Por que os Estados Unidos poderiam ser considerados hoje representativos das democracias liberais contemporâneas?
Yeah, it is a very good question, and I have to say that the level of abstraction that I was looking for in my book is a little bit sort of higher. I mean, the abstraction is higher than simply to look at variants of capitalism. And of course, if you look at variants of capitalism, then very often you talk about the Scandinavian model, you talk about the German of the Rhine model of co-determination. Then you talk maybe about the United States, but you might even take about a very liberal version of the state like in Australia and so on. However, I believe that actually if we have more sort of general view, the US is a very good representative of liberal meritocratic capitalism. Let me explain why. not only because it's the largest country and has, of course, quite a lot of influence on what happens in other countries, but because ideologically, if you go back to this current, let's call it, in different contexts, we can call it neoliberal wave, it did indeed start with Margaret Thatcher and Reagan in 1979, 1980. And it gradually spread to Europe. Now, I don't deny that there are differences between European countries and the United States, but I think that basically European countries can be seen as kind of a subspecies of the US model. And let me explain why. If you look, for example, at France in the 1980s, it had to change its policies under Mitterrand and become much more liberal rather than socialistic when Mitterrand came to power. When he wanted actually to nationalize the banking system, he had to change. And many changes which were in the direction of neoliberalism, or what they called liberal meritocratic capitalism, happened in European countries, so much so that they have moved away from the standard social democratic model. And even in some areas, like, for example, inequality, Sweden, which used to be taken as an exemplar of social democracy, now has had a very significant increase in inequality over the last 30 or 40 years. Sweden is also a country with very high inequality in wealth. The labor markets in practically all European countries, take the Netherlands, for example, have become much more flexible. The temporary labor, non-permanent labor, or in Spain, for example, has become huge. So in other words, there are all these features of liberal or neoliberal capitalism, which of course were, I think, started first in the United States, including commodification, about which I speak in the last chapter of our daily activities, which have spread very much to Europe. So I really don't see Europe as being fundamentally, in that respect, different from the US.
Obrigada, Denise, por favor.
Oi, professor. Obrigada pela oportunidade. Aproveitando um pouquinho a pergunta do Alexandre e puxando também para essas discussões sobre campos ideológicos, os estudos da desigualdade não são novos, né? Autores falam sobre isso há muito tempo, mas recentemente nós temos visto teóricos de outros vieses, inclusive liberais, mais preocupados com essa questão. Aqui no Brasil, intelectuais notáveis, liberais, agora estão chamando atenção para isso. E estão sendo chamados até de comunistas por conta disso. Por quê? Por que agora a desigualdade está recebendo mais atenção de teóricos de todos os espectros?
You're absolutely right. Inequality has become much more important, not only politically, but in terms of social sciences, in terms of what we research, in terms of data that we have, than it was, 20 or 30 years ago. I have to say that Brazil has always had a very important role in the work on inequality, partly because Brazil is a very unequal country. And then people were concerned with inequality for a long time. You have writings and studies, empirical studies on inequality in Brazil going back to the 1960s. So Brazil, in that sense, has been one of at the forefront of the development. Now, the reason why inequality, I think, has become a big topic has to do, in my opinion, with the previous crisis, with the crisis of 2008. Because what happened then is that you had a sort of a stop, or at least a slowdown in growth. And that slowdown in growth sort of revealed certain features of the system, including the fact that the middle class has not actually gained very much, which was masked by ability to borrow until 2008. So really the fault lines of the system in 2008 were revealed very clearly because of the crisis. Something similar is happening now, where the fault lines of the system, be it the health system in the United States or Brazil or the UK, are being very clearly revealed by this crisis. So I think that actually, to go back to inequality, it was really the global financial crisis that actually brought inequality back, when people realized that many of them have really not gained very much through globalization, whereas the top 1% has gained enormously. So that became, I think, a political issue. And at the same time, we were helped by the availability of data, because with big data, we actually can study phenomena in their heterogeneity. And by definition, inequality is heterogeneous, because inequality is the difference in income between X and Y. So it's actually, you cannot synthesize it in the way that you synthesize what is called representative agent in economics. So it's actually, you have to look at the heterogeneity, and for that you need big data. So to summarize, I think there are two developments: slowdown in growth, which revealed big income differences within countries, and accessibility of the data.
Obrigada, Martim, por favor.
Muito obrigado pela sua presença, professor. No decorrer do seu livro, há uma tensão entre o capitalismo político, representado pela China, e o capitalismo liberal meritocrático, representado pelos Estados Unidos. Contudo, no final, o senhor meio que prevê que haverá uma convergência entre esses dois tipos de capitalismo, o capitalismo político e o capitalismo liberal meritocrático. A consequência direta dessa convergência seria uma concentração de poder político e poder econômico nas elites, né? A minha pergunta é o seguinte: isso não foi um processo que se tornou acelerado agora com a pandemia da Covid-19?
Let me just first say that actually what you summarized at the end is indeed true. That's actually in the book. And I have to explain that the book, to some extent, in that area, reacts against, I think, rather naive views that were dominant in the 1990s and 2000s, that the Chinese model of political capitalism will necessarily evolve into direction of the liberal capitalism. So this was a very, I think, utopian and maybe Arcadian picture of the world, where everybody in the world becomes part of liberal capitalism. Democracy functions in a sort of idealized fashion, and basically all the problems remain solved. This is not how the world has evolved in the last, couple of decades, and a much, how should I say, more probable way that the world will evolve is precisely as you mentioned, is that the elites, economic and political elites, gradually unify these two powers. In the United States, they unify it through the economic elite essentially purchasing political power. And that we have seen in practically all the elections, because the cost of elections are so exorbitant that actually only candidates that can collect lots of money, which means candidates that can collect money from the rich people, have a chance to win. And in China, the political elite has gradually expanded into the economic elite. We see that quite a lot from the top people, including the president and everybody below him, who have interests in the economic arena where they actually, of course, make money. So in that sense, in both systems, I think we see the tendency towards the economic and political elite to concentrate both economic and political power, and to create de facto kind of a capitalist plutocracy, or to actually undermine the rule of democracy of one person, one vote. So that would be a much less optimistic scenario for the future. Now, whether the COVID would accelerate that, it's possible. I'm not quite sure that we are still there, because, of course, the political situation nowadays is very unclear. But in many respects, COVID, as you said before, COVID has actually performed the function of an accelerant. In other words, certain developments which were present have been simply accelerated by COVID.
E com isso nós fechamos o nosso primeiro bloco. Voltamos já já, após um breve intervalo, com a entrevista com o economista Branko Milanovic. Estamos de volta com a entrevista com o economista Branko Milanovic. Professor, no seu livro o senhor distingue o capitalismo político e o capitalismo liberal, e a gente tem visto as diferentes maneiras com que os países expoentes das duas modalidades estão lidando com a crise da Covid-19. Recentemente, o FMI fez uma projeção de queda generalizada do PIB mundial, com grandes tombos nos Estados Unidos e na Europa, mas a China ainda poderia crescer levemente, crescer algo em torno de 1% em 2020. Eu pergunto, o que explica essas diferentes respostas à pandemia e como isso pode impactar a desigualdade dentro desses países no pós-Covid?
You know, this is, of course, going back a little bit to the question that you asked me before about possible effects of the pandemic. One of the effects, I think, is also that the competition between the United States and China has become even much more serious and obvious to everybody now than before the pandemic. Partly it was because of the way that the pandemic started, because as we know, of course, it started in China, and partly because the pandemic highlighted the differences in the reaction to the pandemic in China and the United States. Now, China, of course, is the country where the pandemic started, and the reaction of the Chinese authorities in the beginning were not good at all, because they actually took a long time to first figure out that there was a danger of an epidemic, and secondly, they were, of course, they were very slow in letting the central authorities that the epidemic has happened from Wuhan. But on the other hand, they have done an extremely good job in containing the epidemic, where you see the advantages of a more sort of centralized and state-led system, which was able to first, cordon off Wuhan, and then even more recently, Beijing, and so far actually to make the number of victims, even if you do not fully accept the Chinese numbers, there is no doubt that the number of victims in China was many times lower than in the United States. On the other hand, in the United States, even leaving aside the management of Trump and of the federal level, even leaving that aside, the management of the pandemic was extremely bad. And this is something which we will probably be studying for years to come, because it is absolutely striking that the country which spends by far the largest amount of money on health, which means on per capita basis, $10,000 are spent in the United States on health, which is more than the GDP of 2/3 of the world, individual countries, is unable to contain the pandemic. So that would really raise lots of questions about the way that liberal meritocratic capitalism functions when it is faced with a crisis. You can just simply imagine if the United States were faced with a sort of war type crisis, how it would react. If you look at the way it reacted to the pandemic, you can also say that it would actually probably collapse. So, it shows really lack of organization and some sense maybe discipline and resilience in the liberal capitalism as shown in the United States. Now, of course, different countries have moved very differently. You have countries like New Zealand, for example, that have done very well, Australia as well, Germany has done well. So we can obviously not generalize in this case from the US to all the others.
Obrigada. Marta, por favor.
Ainda no campo das consequências da pandemia, no seu livro, o senhor argumenta que a narrativa do capitalismo meritocrático é que o sucesso seria derivado do trabalho duro e não da acumulação de vantagens e, portanto, o fracasso seria derivado de escolhas dos indivíduos. Os efeitos econômicos do combate à pandemia não podem ter efeito sobre essa narrativa, enfraquecer essa narrativa na medida em que fica evidente que o fracasso não é derivado da escolha das pessoas, do esforço dos indivíduos?
No, it's absolutely true. And also to just finish, maybe I did not answer fully the previous question. I think that what pandemic has really revealed in the case of the United States, a huge fault lines, as I said before, for the global financial crisis. In this case, the fault lines and the cleavage between different types of labor. Many of us are actually quite fortunate, that we can work remotely, so we don't really have to face the danger of getting infected on a daily basis. But of course, many people, so-called essential workers, actually are paid less, and they face the danger of the pandemic on a daily basis. So you really have a very high level of inequality there. It almost reminds one, despite the fact, of course, the labor is a voluntary labor, so you might decide not to go to work, but it really reminds one almost of a feudal type of a system where you have people who are actually least well paid working in the occupations that are actually most dangerous. It's really almost like if you have compelled people who cannot survive, obviously, without being paid on a monthly basis, to go and to face an extremely dangerous situation. So in that sense, the pandemic has revealed really a huge difference in different types of labor. And it really has revealed that implicit inequality, where, as you said, your success or your income is not really based very much on what is your individual accomplishment. It's based whether you have been able to get a job which allows you not to go on a daily basis to, face the danger of epidemic. And that job might have been result of you going to school, and you're going to schools which, good schools, presumably, was the result of you having parents who were rich. So basically, you go back to somebody's background and not his or her effort.
Professor, voltando a falar um pouquinho da desigualdade aqui no Brasil. Todo mundo já sabia, mas a pandemia evidenciou o tamanho da desigualdade no Brasil, principalmente nas condições em que condições muito diferentes que as pessoas estão enfrentando a pandemia, né? Tem gente, além dos trabalhadores essenciais, que não podem ficar em casa porque não tem renda mesmo para comer, não tem condição de morar. Aí, nesse debate, como a Denise citou no primeiro bloco, está um debate muito quente aqui sobre desigualdade, estão se debatendo propostas que nunca foram levadas muito a sério na agenda econômica brasileira, como taxar fortunas e também a renda básica universal. Eu sei que o senhor é um pouco cético em relação à renda básica universal. Entre as críticas que o senhor faz é que ela, em vez de limitar a renda dos mais ricos, ela levanta de baixo, né? Mas na pandemia, o que muda? O senhor acha que valeria a pena agora a gente investir numa renda básica universal depois da pandemia?
Yes, first I have to say that, pandemic, like every crisis, is really to some extent a moment of truth. In other words, when things go normally, you don't see that these huge contrasts which might exist in the society. Once you have a crisis, it's a moment of truth. It's actually you either sort of do well and survive, or almost Darwinian, like you fail. So this crisis, I think, has played the same role. And as you said before, actually, when you asked me a question about Brazil, but first of all, I think that new forms of taxation have to be found now, because we are dealing with an emergency situation. It's really almost like in a war. When you have a war, if you plan to win that war, or actually to survive it, you have to put every other consideration as a secondary. Your main consideration now should be, one's main consideration should be to save lives, and to the extent that saving lives is a priority, to make the economy continue existing, because obviously for many people it is necessary for them to survive, so they have to work. But saving lives is, I think, the primary concern. And in that, under such condition, taxing, for example, wealth on a temporary basis, saying that it would be a taxation which would be for the duration of the pandemic, And then afterwards, of course, you can actually decide whether the taxation might continue or not continue and so on, I think makes lots of sense. On the universal basic income, in the book, I'm somewhat skeptical about that for the reasons that I don't need to discuss all now, but including the fact that actually that I thought that putting that on top of the existing systems would be prohibitively expensive, that it might actually lead to a significant percentage of the population that might simply decide not to work and just have the universal basic income. So there are, I think, some good arguments to be careful about UBI, universal basic income. But I have to say that the crisis has made me change my mind somewhat, because I have to acknowledge, and this is, I think, obvious, that if, for example, countries like the United States had universal basic income, the response to the crisis would have been better. In other words, you would not need to create new systems. You would not have to create decisions at the level of Congress to actually pay the salaries. You would actually basically have systemic reaction to the crisis. So in that sense, having UBI would have been better than having the ad hoc measures that we now have had to implement in the United States and many other countries.
Certo, Denise?
Professor, a Lígia falou agora do que o Brasil deve fazer. Eu queria falar do que o Brasil não deve fazer, porque o capitalismo é hegemônico no mundo, mas aqui e ali aparecem cada vez mais sinais de descontentamento. E no Chile, aqui na América do Sul, também as revoltas populares estão mostrando isso. O Chile é tido por muita gente aqui no Brasil, inclusive nosso ministro da Economia, como um grande exemplo para o país. Eu queria saber o que é que o Brasil, da experiência chilena, não deve repetir.
No, I know that, of course, Brazil now has had a political situation where some people, of course, use Chile as an exemplar of a huge success. Obviously, I think Chile has, in some respects, been successful, but Chile is also one of the countries where the gap between what is being measured as a GDP per capita, and which is, of course, a particular sort of type of measurement, and it's a measurement of the mean, because the GDP per capita simply adds all the incomes of everybody in the country and divides by number of people. So if you have a few people with very large incomes, obviously the mean value would be relatively high, but the median value, which means value that represents actual incomes of many people, may not be that high at all. So in that sense, actually, Chile, and that has been revealed not only by the current crisis, but it has been revealed also by the popular resistance and the riots which happened in Chile last year, showed really the limits of that extreme model. It's a country which has grown fast, but it's a country where actually left a significant part of its population behind, with a very high level of inequality. And if you look at Chile with the population size and history that it has, and compare it with Brazil, you actually, to some extent, are surprised that Chile has almost the same level of inequality if you take the Gini coefficient as Brazil. So in other words, it is a country with an extremely high level of inequality. It is a country which actually has left, as I mentioned before, a significant percentage of the population behind, mostly indigenous people. And it's a country with extremely high inequality of wealth, and with, of course, very rich people being in government. So it has really a number of features that were less than desirable, including, for example, the privatized system of pensions that has really delivered very small pensions, and where the fees originally were extremely high. I think that actually many people have started now thinking more deeply about the negative sides of the Chilean experience, and not only about the positive sides, which were really dominant in the past. So I'm not saying that everything in that experience should be rejected, but I think that one has to be much more critical when considering Chile as an exemplar for Latin America than people were in the past.
Alexandre, por favor.
Professor, um capítulo muito interessante do seu livro, diria até surpreendente, é quando o senhor aborda a questão da corrupção. A corrupção, ela seria, nas suas palavras, endêmica a regimes de capitalismo político. O senhor, inclusive, o senhor cita alguns casos, como a própria China, o Vietnã, a Rússia, cria uma tabela com países que teriam o capitalismo político, seriam países com níveis de corrupção mais altos do que a média do mundo. Em compensação, o senhor argumenta que também são países que cresceram mais do que a média. Então, eu acho que valeria um pouco a gente o senhor elaborar sobre esse tema, para a gente entender se há uma relativização da corrupção. Aqui, o Brasil, nós temos um problema seríssimo histórico de corrupção, um país que já teve político sendo associado a rouba mais faz, enfim, até uma ideia de que um pouco de corrupção é tolerável em nome do crescimento econômico. Como é que o senhor elaboraria mais essa questão para a gente entender se existe uma corrupção tolerável ou não?
Yes, actually, let me put it in a context. You know, when I discuss political capitalism, as you said, I argue that corruption is endemic to political capitalism because political capitalism has two features which generate corruption. One feature is a bureaucracy that in political capitalism, like in China or Vietnam, is a bureaucracy that is, in principle, efficient and tries to follow the rules. However, because political capitalism has to rely on discretionary use of the rules, it really limits the ability of bureaucracy in all cases to follow the rules. They might follow in many cases where people do not have political influence. But in cases, the rule of law really stops applying. So what is called the areas of lawlessness, not only the area of lawlessness where actually there is no police, but the area of lawlessness where you actually cannot pursue some people who have political power. So they essentially are that, inherent corruption in such a system. However, it does not mean that inherent corruption necessarily is linked with lower growth. And we have actually seen attempts in the case of China in particular to unbundle the corruption. And I think it's a very sort of a promising approach where actually different types of corruptions are not really considered equally bad. There's some corruption, which is called access corruption, where basically it's really a profit-sharing mechanism between the government officials who are allowing certain investment to take place and private businessmen who are making that investment. So in other words, you are essentially giving that right of investment to a private businessman, or private company, but you're also taking part of money for yourself. So it's really like a profit-sharing mechanism. It does not look good, but on the other hand, it enables investments to take place, and to some extent, it's recovered through higher and faster growth. So this is the argument to distinguish, for example, that type of access corruption from the other corruption where you basically do clear embezzlement of government funds. You steal the government funds. So I think it makes sense to actually disentangle or distinguish between different types of corruption. But secondly, I also want to mention that with globalization and with ability to move money between different jurisdictions much more easily, we have now a generalized corruption. So it is not only the case of China or political capitalism. We have corruption that has really spread to practically all countries in the world. Of course, I know that in Brazil, it is a big issue, which led to, of course, to the fall of government and, of course, to Lula being put in jail and Dilma being impeached. But it is a problem which is worldwide. And I think that economists who are not really in the business of ethics, of morality, have to accept corruption as basically a rent. It's yet another type of income that we should try to include in our studies of inequality much more than we have been able to do before. So I think it is really a linkage between globalization and corruption, which needs to be studied much more than we have done.
Martim?
Uma das partes mais interessantes do seu livro, professor, é quando o senhor fala de terceirização da moral como uma das consequências da vitória do capitalismo. Ou seja, a ausência de freios morais na pessoa humana e que esses freios eles seriam transferidos para as leis, né? A pergunta que eu faço é, se essas leis elas fracassam ou fracassarem, qual seria a nova moral que poderia manter o capitalismo funcionando de forma justa?
Yes, I think that part of the book is quite interesting because my argument is that the capitalist relations of production have not stopped any longer, or do not stop any longer at the level of company or our, daily work. They have moved into our families, into our private space. They have moved into our leisure activities. Actually, it has become much more difficult now to distinguish which is sort of a leisure or pleasure activity and what is commercialized or money-making activity. You have, of course, as you know, many people who spend hours and hours, for example, on the social media, and then they become influencers. So they actually sort of commodify what was originally a leisure activity, watching movies or watching, being on the internet, learning something, or just finding what your friends are doing. So another way that actually we are outsourcing morality, as you said, actually, and it's actually a subtitle of one of the sections of my book, is that the relations, which were personal relations, let's suppose marriage, let's suppose relations between parents and children, have now really become legalized, and that's actually another intrusion of capitalism in our private life, where you make the prenuptial agreement with your wife, you actually have certain rules of behavior with your children who can actually sue you if you don't follow these rules. In many cases you have, this has now become very prevalent, the signing on non-disclosure agreements, which is very an interesting feature that has not really been sort of studied for what it should be, is that you essentially now have agreements where people agree to limit their right of free speech in writing for a given amount of money. So it's essentially you're buying the agreement to free speech. If I give you the non-disclosure agreement, you're basically agreeing that for a given amount of money, I would control what you're going to say. So, in that sense, this capitalistic relations of production, or to put it differently, I think it's probably better, the commodification has really spread into our private lives. And I think this is a great success of capitalism in some sense, is that not only has it really spread geographically to include China, Vietnam, and other countries, Russia, but it was actually spread into our private lives.
Certo, com isso encerramos o nosso segundo bloco desse Roda Viva e voltamos já já, após um breve intervalo. É só um instantinho, fique aí. Estamos de volta com a entrevista com o economista Branko Milanovic. Professor, um dos principais pressupostos da globalização é a mobilidade, tanto de riquezas quanto de pessoas. E ela ficou extremamente prejudicada agora em virtude da pandemia. Isso agrava alguns fenômenos que a gente já vinha também verificando em razão da globalização, como a xenofobia, né? A gente vê aí pessoas se referindo ao novo coronavírus como vírus chinês, e fechando as fronteiras e se fechando para algumas partes do mundo. O senhor acha que isso tende a ser transitório ou vai se perenizar de alguma maneira?
I think that these extreme closures of borders now are temporary because they would last so long as the pandemic is not under control. But of course, your question has also another dimension, which is that migration is obviously a huge issue in Europe and now recently more so in the United States. And, this is a very difficult issue because technically speaking, globalization is, as you said, actually free movement of capital, labor, ideas, technology, and goods. Now, we are talking about all the free movements, including ideas, including ability to, have discussion across continents, across countries. But then we have one factor production, labor, that we say, well, that factor production cannot move freely. So there is, at the heart of globalization, there is an inherent contradiction between the fact that globalization should include movement of labor and the resistance of rich countries to accept more labor coming from poor countries. Even people like, and I quote John Rawls quite a lot in my book. I have to check how many times I did quote him. But for example, John Rawls was very liberal and very even socialistic in his view of the organization of individual societies, was somebody who was against movement of labor driven by economic factors. So many people are very skeptical and they're against migration. And sometimes, of course, the extreme form of being against migration becomes a xenophobic type of reaction. So that, I think, problem is also been exacerbated by globalization, by the pandemic, because the pandemic has led, as you said, actually, to people sort of being enclosed within their own borders much more than before. Of course, that I believe it is temporary. I believe that in some cases, for example, like Spain, you had even people who were enclosed within provinces, so they could not even move within their own country freely. So these are the temporary phenomena. But the issue of migration and the issue of how migration affects the position of the middle class in the rich countries and how migration affects the social welfare state and the customs and the culture of the countries, that problem, I think, would remain. And I think that problem is particularly severe for European countries that face a declining population and at the same time are very resistant to accepting the new labor coming mostly from African countries.
Certo, Lígia, por favor.
Professor, falando ainda sobre a pandemia, esse tema que infelizmente tem roubado o espaço nas nossas conversas, o senhor citou antes os Estados Unidos como um exemplo de um país que, embora domine a ciência, né, tenha saído muito mal no combate à pandemia, e a Nova Zelândia como um país que se saiu muito bem. Infelizmente, se a gente fosse dividir o mundo em dois, acho que o Brasil ia ter que ficar nesse grupo dos que se saíram mal, né? Mais parecido com os Estados Unidos. Que tipo de herança, de problema o Brasil e esses países podem herdar por essa má condução da pandemia? O senhor vê, por exemplo, o risco de instabilidade social, instabilidade política, instabilidade democrática, falando um pouquinho aqui para o Brasil?
E eu vou atalhar a pergunta da Lígia, trazendo para um aspecto mais econômico, que a gente viu aí muito nitidamente, diante da pandemia, as consequências da nossa desindustrialização, que é um dos fenômenos de que o senhor também trata no livro. A gente está fadado a voltar da pandemia como aquilo que temos sido, um produtor de commodities para o mundo?
Brazil has, of course, a fairly extensive industrial and technological base. So I don't think that Brazil could be put in that category because it's a technologically a very sophisticated country. However, the reaction of Brazil to the crisis has been disastrous. Actually, we should really use the words correctly, and I think it's a disastrous reaction. The number of victims, lack of organization, desire to actually sort of minimize the threat of the pandemic, and to believe that if you minimize the threat of the pandemic, somehow it would go away, are really very bad reactions. The same thing is true for the United States, which actually to some extent is even more dramatic because, as you said in the question, the US is technologically a global leader in practically not all, but most of the areas. And when I think of the fact that, for example, the US, simply if you look at the level of knowledge, that the US has probably several hundred schools of public health. The United States professors probably publish several thousand papers about the public health. And that once in like 100 years, when you're faced with a crisis of this proportion, you absolutely don't know what to do, and you essentially do nothing until the crisis hits you. It's absolutely remarkable, and I said I am sure it will be studied in the future how not to do certain things, because here we have seen really a total failure of academic sphere, of a political sphere, of a health sphere. So you basically have, in the case of the United States, a total failure.
Certo. Marta, por favor.
No seu livro, o senhor defende que um programa de igualdade de dotações e de capacitação seria uma saída mais igualitária para as tendências, a crescente tendência à desigualdade das democracias liberais. Mas quais seriam as forças que sustentariam um programa desse tipo, se o senhor identifica que há uma tendência à captura do Estado pelas elites e há uma espécie de cansaço da classe média com as políticas igualitárias do passado? Então, quais seriam as forças políticas que sustentariam um programa desse tipo?
Yes, my sort of, when it comes to recommendations, I'm actually very brief on that because I think some of them derived for a reader from the arguments that I made before. So when I speak of the reproduction of the elite in the liberal capitalist regime, I, of course, emphasize that the reproduction of the elite takes place through channels. One channel is ability to give to your children the education which would then lead them to high salary or high paying jobs. The second way that the production of the elite takes place is through inheritance. So then the recommendations are, I think, sort of derived from that way in which the elite is being reproduced. One recommendation is that the access to very good public schools has to be much more easy for anybody and to be more generalized. In other words, that means that public schools would have to become really the best schools rather than private schools. That really implies a huge redistribution and a huge reorganization in which way the public money is being used. So it's actually much more money for public education. Theoretically, in that case, you would actually have children from any background being able to go to the best schools and not pay anything. Or at least not pay directly. Obviously, the schools would be funded through taxation that would be progressive and would be paid by the rich people. The second sort of recommendation is a recommendation about greater, deconcentration of property or capital. In other words, in all countries, in Brazil, for example, is a very good example of that. Income from capital or wealth are very heavily concentrated. We have a Gini coefficient which is like over 90, meaning that really essentially 5% of the population controls most of the financial wealth of the country. So there are different ways in which you can try to deconcentrate. It's giving advantages to the middle class to invest in financial assets, for example, by lower taxes on the returns that they receive. by workers' shares, what is called employee stock ownership plans in the United States. Many countries also have that, so that actually workers receive shares of the companies where they work. And finally, the third point here, so the first is public education, second, advantages for the middle class to invest in financial assets, and the third one is taxation of inheritance. So that I think is very important, because through taxation of inheritance, you're able to make sort of chances of different people somewhat more equal and not depending on their parents' wealth. So I think that the third element is quite important. Although I know that actually many people don't like taxation of inheritance, but I have to mention that you don't need to tax every inheritance. You obviously can tax only inheritances that go over a certain amount of money.
Certo, Alexandre, por favor.
Professor, eu gostaria de pegar uma carona na última pergunta em relação a esse tema da influência das elites econômicas nas decisões políticas de um país, o que me lembra até um pouco uma referência ao próprio Manifesto Comunista, que dizia que num governo capitalista o governo seria um comitê para gerir os negócios da burguesia, né? Então, a minha dúvida, eu queria que o senhor pudesse elaborar um pouquinho, é o seguinte: não é uma característica de qualquer organização humana, desde das sociedades tribais, onde você tem uma hierarquia, e a hierarquia vai levar a uma elite. Essa elite não é mais influente nas decisões políticas do que o resto da população. O que torna a influência da elite no capitalismo meritocrático diferente ou especial da influência de qualquer elite em qualquer governo ao longo da história?
Yes, this is of course also part of the last question that I did not fully answer, and this is actually what are the political forces that could make, let's suppose, that problem that I just mentioned feasible. So actually, what are the political forces that would actually make public education accessible to all, high taxation of inheritance, and redistribution of property? The problem there, and I totally agree with you, is that actually the political forces that are benefiting from the current system don't have obviously an incentive to change that system. And they are powerful enough in most cases to block any change. So in reality, the only channel, I think, which remains in democracies is the channel of popular mobilization and vote. So it sounds sort of obvious, but really it is through party organizations, through popular mobilization, and through voting behavior that one could bring such change. Obviously, the other way to bring the change is through revolution. But I think that the change brought through democratic process is probably more durable and more likely. So this would be the only answer. I think it's very difficult that this change can be brought because the people who maintain the political power do not have an incentive to do that. Moreover, the entire political power is structured in such a way that the ostensible formal rights really are remaining simply formal. As you know, in many countries, actually, a percentage of people in the US, about only 50% of people vote. The percentage of people who vote actually is higher among higher income groups. And on top of that, of course, they are the groups that have much greater influence on politicians. So it is very difficult to dislodge them from that position. I don't think it's impossible to do that, but I think it is very difficult. And last point on this, actually the changes, it goes back to our original question about social democratic systems in Europe after World War II. The changes which happened then were really the changes that we are talking about now, but they were brought up under very special conditions where you had really very strong trade unions, very strong socialist and communist parties, and a challenge coming from the socialist bloc and the Soviet Union. So in that context, the capitalist or democratic system reacted in sort of preserving its own power, but redistributing the assets, reducing inequality, and giving much greater say to the people who were excluded before. Nowadays, we don't have that kind of pressures. So going back to your question, I think actually, honestly, I'm more skeptical about the possibility of realizing a very ambitious social agenda now.
Certo, com isso nós fechamos o nosso terceiro bloco dessa entrevista e voltamos já já para o quarto e último bloco da conversa com o Branko Milanovic. Não sai daí. Estamos de volta para o quarto e último bloco da nossa entrevista. Professor Branko, no seu livro, o senhor faz certa restrição ao uso da palavra populismo para designar alguns dos regimes, alguns dos governos que nós temos no mundo hoje. Nos Estados Unidos, a gente vê o governo Trump, que foi eleito muito em cima de uma plataforma de primeiro lugar a América, de fechamento de fronteiras, um discurso que por muitos é visto como populista. E agora, diante dessa resposta que o senhor chama de desastrosa à pandemia, existe um risco que não havia antes de ele não se reeleger. Como o senhor vê a relação entre o momento atual e esses regimes que se chama de populistas, mas que o senhor não considera essa terminologia mais adequada?
Yes, I actually wrote in a blog about that. I think that of course, many people see Trump differently, and he's a very difficult person to pin down ideologically, because I think his ideology is not very clear, maybe even to himself. But I actually see him as an ultimate triumph of neoliberalism in the following sense. I think that Trump essentially has taken all the sort of features of how he was running his companies and simply transformed that to the level of the state. So he basically sees the population as his employees. So the population is dispensed. You can actually fire people, you can take them, employ them, but they are to some extent his employees. They are not slaves, but they're his employees. So in that sense, he is actually unable, I believe, to see the difference between the organization of the state and the organization of the company. And in that sense, he has transformed sort of neoliberalism from the company level to the state level. So that's how I think actually how I see Trump. But when you mention populism, the reason why I didn't like the term populism, and I think that I use it only once in the book, is because it has been used by people whom I mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, people who essentially believe that liberal capitalism is the only way that societies can be organized. And then they take the period of the, Clinton rule and others, and essentially sort of take this technocratic rule of what was used to be called by Blair the third way, and everything else which is beyond that is suddenly called populism. So then you have populism of the left, which will be Bernie Sanders. Then you have populism of the right, which will be Trump. And then essentially what the problem with that approach is that in many countries where the main parties have been rejected after the previous crisis, like, for example, in Spain, in France, and elsewhere, you end up with, or in Italy especially, you end up with 70% of the electorate being then populist. And I think the meaningfulness of that term becomes very, very small. So that's why I actually don't like the term populist, because by implication, it sort of seems to say that only a very narrow slice of technocratic decision-making is okay. These are the serious people, and everybody else is either left-wing or right-wing populists. And I think that actually, as I said, methodologically, it does not make much sense anymore.
Certo, Denise, por favor.
Professor, o senhor diz no seu livro que o capitalismo é forte e se tornou hegemônico, entre outros motivos, porque a sociedade absorveu valores que apoiam esse sistema, como, por exemplo, colocar o ficar rico acima de tudo. E isso quer dizer que muita gente que se revolta contra as consequências ruins do capitalismo não necessariamente são a favor de regras mais igualitárias, de ideais utópicos socialistas e consciência de classe são ideias amplamente rejeitadas em todas as camadas da população. Eu queria saber se isso é um obstáculo para a formação de forças populares que possam pressionar por medidas de diminuição da desigualdade e se a pandemia, que efetivamente parece que semeou o sentimento de maior solidariedade em todo o mundo, se pode efetivamente mudar os valores e os sentimentos da sociedade nesse sentido.
Yes, first, of course, I actually think that there is a necessary sort of mutual interdependence and reinforcement between the values that promote a given system, which are actually the values that make the system expand. To use Marxist terminology, the values which makes sort of expanded reproduction of the system, and the values that are maintained by individuals. You know, it goes back to Plato. If, you remember Plato had 4 types of governments, of what he called imperfect governments. They include tyranny, democracy, demarchy, and oligarchy. And for each of these 4 ways that society is organized politically, he also had a typical man, which a man or person, man or woman, who embodies the characters of that society and who is actually the main strength in terms of its own values behind that type of society. So the same, I think, is true with what they call hyper-commercialized and globalized capitalism today. The dominant value, which doesn't mean that every person has such values, but the dominant values are, as you said, the values of becoming rich. That was Deng Xiaoping famous, quip that actually it is glorious to become rich. The same thing is true with Margaret Thatcher. The same is true with Reagan. And that value sort of embodies, is a dominant value today, which you see in many instances. I don't need to go into all of that now. And actually in many emerging economies, it is seen more clearly because people are to some extent less hypocritical and they don't cover it as obviously as in more sort of older rich societies like the UK or the United States, where very often under the guise of hypocrisy that is being covered, but it's nevertheless the dominant feature. And that dominant feature, individual feature, which is actually acquisition of money and wealth, is the feature that perfectly parallels the necessary element for the expansion of capitalist relations of production. So these 2 things go well together. The point is then, if we really believe that there should be a change in these dominant relations which are represented by capitalism, we cannot do that so long as the value system which we have as individuals is different. And that means that really, if you will, the change might even start from the value systems that we have, where we might actually not view the acquisition of wealth as really the prime objective of our lives. And that might eventually lead to the change in the economic system. So that's a possibility. That's obviously something which is at the very long run. I'm not sure that this crisis would actually have such an impact, but I may be wrong on that. But as I said, I think that the crisis will have impact in other areas, but changing the value system would be more difficult.
Certo. Martim, por favor.
Aproveitando a deixa da Denise, e para terminar aqui o ciclo, eu queria saber se o senhor acha que a solução para escapar desta ânsia pela riqueza que caracteriza o capitalismo hiperglobalizado nosso não seria um retorno às comunidades com vínculos afetivos e uma menor escala na produção e na renda.
It could be, but this so-called organic relations, the return to organic relations rather than mechanistic relations that, of course, we now have increasingly. I'm not ruling this out, but I think it's very difficult to have such relations in a globalized world. A globalized world allows us to have contacts with many people, people whom we would actually meet only once, and who can come from very different backgrounds, very different interests, very different views of the world. And in such a world, our depth of contacts is very low. The superficiality of contacts is, of course, quite strong. And the contacts are made possible because of our implicit value system that actually puts, as I said before, material objectives at the forefront. Everything else may be different between us, but we can actually understand each other through the language of profit very well. Now, to go back to more organic, family-oriented relations would require, I'm afraid, really the abandonment of globalization as we know it. It is just difficult for me to see organic family type of relations coexisting with a globalized world. They could exist if the world were actually then really separated in either national or even subnational groups. But as I said, it's difficult for me to see it at the global level.
Certo, e com isso a gente encerra. O nosso tempo, infelizmente, chegou ao fim. Eu agradeço muito ao Branko Milanovic pela entrevista e também ao Alexandre Borges, a Denise Godoy, a Lígia Guimarães, a Marta Rett, ao Martim Vasques da Cunha. Agradeço sobretudo a você pela sua audiência. Nós voltamos na próxima semana com mais um Roda Viva. Fiquem bem, permaneçam em casa ainda o máximo que puderem e até segunda-feira, às 10 da noite.